Please state your name.
David Enrique Mesa.
One night, two police officers were out on routine patrol about 20 miles south of the US border near the town of Rosarito. It was the middle of the night on a lonely coastal highway. There was no traffic, no houses, just a pitch-black ocean on one side and a steep drop into darkness on the other. In the distance, they could see a vehicle pulled over onto the shoulder, and its hazard lights were blinking in the dark. It stood out amongst the darkness. There was no one standing beside it, no one waving for help. They pulled up behind the car and stepped out to take a closer look. It was so quiet that time of night that the only sound they could hear was that of the blinking hazard lights. As one of the officers approached these blinking orange lights, he noticed something was off. He could see the door smeared in something red, looked like blood. A few steps closer, more blood, this time on the ground. There was significant blood at the scene. It seemed like a spray or a pool, not just a small smear, as if someone had cut their hand. At first, the officers assumed that this was the case of a hit and run, a late-night crash, a pedestrian thrown into the dark. But then they saw something else. On the roadside, just visible in the beams of their flashlights, were drag marks, dark streaks where someone heavy had been pulled away from the car over the edge of the shoulder towards the canyon. The officers followed this trail slowly. The ground sloped down away from the road, and a few meters from the edge, they started to see pieces, fragments of what looked like tissue, what looked like organs caught on the rocks and shrubs. It's clear that whatever happened here, it was brutal. They kept following the meandering trail down the ravine, and that's when they stopped, because there, lying face up amongst the rocks, was a man. His body was all twisted, his clothes soaked in his own blood, and where they stood, they could see that his torso had been opened up, his insides exposed. His head was so mangled up, it was almost severed off the neck. The officers immediately radioed for backup, and in time, when backup did arrive, they did a thorough investigation of the vehicle. A preliminary search showed that the vehicle's glove box contained a stack of toll receipts and a passport. You see, the man lying outside was not a local. He was an American citizen in his early 50s. His name was Jake Merendino. And within hours, it would become clear that nothing about his life or his death was simple. By the time the sun came up over the Baja California coastline, the ravine was no longer quiet. Crime scene tape marked the edge of the highway. Forensics officers picked their way down the slope, carefully taking photos of blood trails and footprints before anything was disturbed. What was interesting about the vehicle was that the engine was off, its keys were gone, but the hazard lights were left on, pulsing, when the officers first arrived, as you know. There was also obvious signs of a struggle by the driver's side door, blood on the frame, splatter on the ground, and clear drag tracks leading away from the car and over the edge. This poor man had suffered a rushed, violent, and agonizing death before he was hurriedly abandoned at the bottom of the ravine. But why such violence? And when the autopsy was conducted, it told a story that was even more brutal than what the officers had seen at the scene. Jake Merendino, 51 years old, had been stabbed 24 times. The wounds were clustered around his torso, his back, and his arms, consistent with a frenzied, up-close attack. 2 deep slashes to his neck had cut so far that he was left almost decapitated. His abdomen had been opened. He was, in clinical terms, practically gutted. The official cause of death was massive blood loss, but the medical examiner believed something else as well, that Jake had been alive when his attacker or attackers dragged him to the edge and threw him into that ravine. What they couldn't figure out was why. What was an American citizen doing on a dark stretch of road, presumably by himself? Was this a robbery gone wrong? A carjacking? something tied to cartels or organized crime? So the investigators began with the basics. From the position of the blood and the damage to the vehicle, they concluded that Jake had been assaulted while standing outside the driver's side door. There were no signs of another body nearby, no second trail of blood, no indication that anyone else had been killed or seriously hurt at the scene except Jake. And as you know, inside the vehicle, several toll receipts and a passport was recovered. They showed recent crossings on the toll road leading down to the Rosarito area, evidence that Jake had taken this route very recently, and the passport confirmed that Jake Merendino was an American citizen from Texas. Once authorities notified U.S. officials, the news made its way to Jake's family and friends, and they were just as shocked about what had happened. They were stunned about where and how he had been found, because in their minds, Jake wasn't living a dangerous life. Sure, he was a wealthy retiree who had just started what he thought would be the best chapter of his life. You see, Jake Merendino was in love, and he hadn't moved to Mexico alone. But first, we need to know who Jake was. Jake had been adopted as a baby and grew up in a comfortable middle-class home. Both of his parents worked for what was then Mobil Oil, and they stayed with the company long enough to build a significant stockholding and retirement benefits. Jake grew up comfortably, and he saw the savings and investments of his parents give them a fruitful future. But unfortunately, as they grew older, their health also started to fail, and they never truly got to enjoy what they had saved up for. Friends would later say that before Jake ever thought about seriously retiring himself, he thought about his parents, their doctor visits, their bills, their comfort. He took care of everything on his end, and when they died, they left everything to him. It wouldn't be wrong to say that Jake inherited a small fortune. He was, by most standards, wealthy. Jake worked in the banking industry, but he never really talked about his job the way people do. The details of his career were less important than what he did with his time off. The travel, the restaurants, the shopping, and the long conversations over good wine. Jake had what most in Texas might call Southern manners, polite, attentive, and quick to offer a drink or pick up the check. In fact, one could say he had a reputation for being extremely generous. If a friend needed help with rent, he was there. If one of his friends mentioned a medical issue they were struggling to pay, Jake was the first to quietly offer up his card. And in his personal life, Jake was open and unapologetic about being gay. He liked going out, meeting people, and he made no secret of his attraction to younger, fit men, especially Latino men. At a time when so many people tried to keep their private lives hidden, Jake didn't see the point in pretending, and that's why he started spending more time in northern Mexico. The coast just south of San Diego drew American retirees with its ocean views and lower cost of living. Jake found a development called Palacio del Mar, perched on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific, with glass balconies and resort-style amenities. He sent excited messages to his friends about this place, including one voicemail where he described this new place as
fabulous. Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous.
Just fabulous. And he wasn't just talking about the place, it was the whole lifestyle, the sun, the ocean, a fresh start in a country he associated with warmth, beauty, and the kind of men that he'd always been drawn to. And Jake didn't plan to enjoy this life alone, because on his trips to San Diego and across the border, he'd met someone much younger, someone who he deemed special. In June of 2013, on a vacation in San Diego, Jake met a man named David Enrique Meza. The exact details of this first meeting depend on who you believe, but everyone agrees on one thing. From the moment Jake saw David, he was smitten. David was in his early 20s, Latino with a lean, athletic build and a noticeable dimple when he smiled. He was decades younger than Jake, and he turned heads. To Jake's friends, the age gap was the first red flag. They'd often see older, wealthy men fall hard for younger partners before, and they knew how easily those relationships could tip into something transactional. But Jake brushed off their concerns. From his perspective, he was in control, he knew what he was doing, and he was just trying to enjoy this relationship. At first, this relationship did seem casual. Jake would fly out, they'd spend time together, then go back to their separate lives. But over the months that followed, it became clear that this wasn't just a fling. David was sweet. He sent Jake affectionate messages and love cards. To people who saw them together, they could come across as attentive and devoted. But behind the scenes, David was hiding a secret. You see, David had another life. Online, he appeared on several gay adult websites, performing under names Mario Romo.
My name is Mario Romo. I'm 21 years old. I'm from San Diego.
Are you aware that you'll be filmed having sex and it'll be put online?
Yes, ma'am.
Please state your name.
David Enrique Mesa.
He worked for companies that specialized in young, athletic men. On a personal information sheet, he described himself as into sports, adrenaline, and being really adventurous, someone who loved meeting new people. Jake knew that side of David. In fact, when he found out, he seemed almost proud of it. He would show off nude photos of David to close friends, bragging about his boyfriend's looks. What Jake might not have fully appreciated, at least early on, was how they'd actually been introduced. You see, David had posted an escort ad. Their first interaction was, essentially, a business transaction. But over time, that line blurred. As the relationship deepened, Jake's spending on David escalated. He didn't just pay for dinners or small gifts. He started buying big-ticket items. First came a Volkswagen GTI, then a Nissan Nismo 370Z, one of the flashiest sports cars from Japan, then a bright red motorcycle. And Jake would step in all the time. When David's teeth started to hurt, Jake paid for dental appointments and cosmetic work. But hey, the spending didn't just stop there. Jake even covered David's tuition so he could enroll in nursing classes. He gave David a credit card, even set up regular deposits, around $1,500 a month, directly into David's account. And if that wasn't enough, he even added David as a joint account holder onto his bank account, giving him direct access to all of his money. Hey, and if you're like me and wondering why would someone even do this, well, Jake's friends were wondering the same thing. They were worried that this guy was completely blinded by infatuation, that the age difference and power imbalance made him vulnerable. But Jake saw it differently. He saw David as a partner, not just a project. He seriously saw a life together with David, pictured him together living this perfect retirement home. But unfortunately, it was around this time that Jake made a decision that would, on paper, bind his future even more tightly to David's. A decision about what would happen to everything he owned if something ever happened to him. By the spring of 2015, the paperwork for that condo was almost done. All that was left was the final signatures and formalities in Mexico. On April 30th, Jake and David drove south together from the United States into Baja California. The next day, on May 1st, they headed back towards the border and then returned again to the Rosarito area. This time, Jake drove his Range Rover. David followed behind on the red motorcycle that Jake had given him as a Christmas present. And because the new condo wasn't quite yet ready to move in, they checked into a nearby place called Bobby's by the Sea, a roadside hotel overlooking the water, just a short drive from Palacio del Mar. That evening, sometime between 7 and 8 p.m., David came down the lobby to have a bottle of wine opened. It was an ordinary detail, but it later proved that the two men were together in that room, setting in for the night. But just a few hours later, the the plans changed suddenly. According to David, a family situation came up. Around 10:30, he told Jake that he had to leave because of a family emergency. The hotel manager recalls hearing a motorcycle start and leave the parking lot. In fact, border records would show that David crossed north into the United States at around 11 p.m., and Jake stayed behind in that room alone. Sometime in the early hours, he took a phone call, a call that rattled him as he rushed away, and hotel staff remember him driving out in his Range Rover not long after. He told the guards that he was going to help a friend who was stranded on the road, and that was the last time any hotel staff members saw Jake alive. And we know what happened next. The body in the ravine, the hazard blinking lights, the officers on the dark highway. But what we still don't have, because there were no cameras on the road, no witnesses, is a live view of what happened between the time Jake left Bobby's by the Sea and the moment those officers found him. What was strange is that at 3:57 a.m., an hour after Jake's body was found, David Meza crossed back into the United States on his motorcycle. It was a messy investigation, and it took weeks for officers to put together all the data points. But even before then, one detail from that weekend started raising serious questions. Because David had returned to Mexico with one partner, and it wasn't Jake. It was a completely different person. It was a woman. The same day Jake's body was found, and just hours after his murder, a familiar SUV pulled into the parking lot at Bobby's by the Sea. It was David, and with him was another person, a woman. She was also visibly pregnant. Just the way they stood around, talked to the front desk, and moved through the space, it was obvious that these two were very close. David told the hotel staff that he was simply there to pick up his personal belongings from the room he had shared with Jake, and when he collected his things, he left with a woman in the SUV. Her name, they recall, was Taylor Langston. And you know what the real shocker was? It's that she and David had been together for years. In fact, they were engaged, and she was expecting his child. And Taylor had no idea about this entire life of David. In fact, she had no idea that he was an adult performer and basically an escort. To her, he was someone working as a personal assistant for a wealthy man named George. George, according to David, was older, in poor health, and needed help managing his affairs. David told people that George was sick, that he might not have long to live. The way he described it, his work involved travel, late-night calls, and a lot of time away. But it was all a lie. This wealthy persona might have explained a little bit of the gift, the cars, and the sudden influx of money, but Taylor had no idea that George was really Jake. She knew nothing about the hotel rooms, the adult websites, or the escort ads. She didn't know that while she planned a future with David and their baby, he was promising another man a life together on a Mexican beachfront condo. So if you're keeping track about this messy love triangle, it seems that David was playing at least what appears to be both sides. But wait till you hear what happens next. Because once Mexican authorities confirmed Jake's identity and notified the US, news of his death not only spread like wildfire, but people soon started asking, what about his investments and savings, an estimate into the millions of dollars? I mean, the new condo he bought in Rosarito paled in comparison, but even that was worth nearly $270,000. And then came up the question of Jake's will. You see, Jake loved animals, and he wanted to give his money away to causes he cared about, such as animal charities, if anything would have happened to him. At least that's what's said in his will. But through this journey, David Meza's lawyers contested this old will. They produced this handwritten note on Hercar Hotel stationery from December 2014 and submitted that Jake's true final wishes was to leave everything to David. Not a percent to anyone else, not a specific asset to anyone else, but everything to David. And because David had access to Jake's joint account, he wasted no time in withdrawing all of the remaining funds. He wasn't leaving anything to chance, especially not the courts. Because this was such a sloppy handwritten note, it seemed almost impossible that it would overwrite a will that was written, witnessed, and lodged with the lawyers. But what this did do was give investigators a reason to dig deeper into probable cause. Funny enough, they started by tracking this note and the journey of it from the Chula Vista to the courthouse in Texas. And what they found was a video clip from a UPS store. In the footage, it's David Meza standing at the counter. Besides him is Taylor, a heavily pregnant Taylor, and together they're mailing out a package. The package that contained this handwritten will. And then, Jake was already dead. It seemed that David did not mourn Jake at all. There he was at UPS mailing out this will, this handwritten will, practically before most of Jake's family even knew that he was dead. But if David truly had a hand in Jake's demise, then the question is, who actually killed Jake? Because David was out of the country. It didn't take long for the FBI to get involved, and on June 4th, 2015, they executed a search warrant on the apartment that David shared with Taylor, and inside, they found something that belonged to Jake. It was his iPad. Taking David in for interrogation, the next day, they asked him some basic questions. At first, he denied everything. He said he hadn't been in Mexico the night that Jake was killed. He said he did not have a relationship with Jake at all. In his version, there was no secret boyfriend, no double life. But the problem for David was that the investigators already had all the records. The border crossing logs showed his motorcycle going into Mexico and back out in the exact window when Jake was attacked. Cell sites and GPS data from his phone placed him in the same area around 1:30 in the morning, and then moving forward to the area where Jake's body was later found. Around 2:15 a.m., his phone pinged near the stretch of road. When confronted with this, David's story shifted. He now admitted traveling to meet Jake that night, but claimed he was only there to steal. And in this new version, he met Jake to get the condo key so he could take the stereo equipment, then left him alive and drove back to San Diego. Both David and Taylor also had an alibi. They said that during the time that Jake was killed, they were at a friend's house. They described just sitting at that dining table for hours, just chit-chatting before heading home. But when the police spoke to this friend, he had a very different story. He said he hadn't seen David or Taylor in more than a year. And then he completely threw away David's alibi. He said that David actually called him and told him to lie, to tell authorities that they had been with him the entire night. The more investigators looked into David, the more guilty he looked. They recovered messages that he sent to Taylor about that very night, and in where he expressed regret and anxiety about what he had done.
Ever since I did that, I told you, I feel like my life is going on hard. I honestly feel like with myself, ever since I did that, and so every day of my life, I wake up feeling guilty. I wake up beating myself for doing that. I had no choice. I had a choice. But I did it because I wanted to, with my family.
They found Google searches he'd made about that night and any news around it. The picture that started to form was not of a panicked man caught up something beyond his control, but instead, it was of someone constantly adjusting his story, looking for angles, and trying to stay just far enough ahead of the evidence to try and escape it. But by late 2015, that gap had closed. 6 months after that June interrogation, federal authorities made their move. David Enrique Meza was arrested and charged.
Happening now, a young South Bay couple is in court. They're accused of killing a wealthy Texas man. Now, police arrested 25-year-old David Meza and 20-year-old Taylor Langston yesterday. That's them. Prosecutors say Meza stabbed Jake Merendino and then left his body on the road from Rosarito to Ensenada in May.
The case against David went to trial in a court in San Diego. Because Jake was an American citizen killed abroad, prosecutors charged David with foreign domestic violence resulting in murder, as well as conspiracy to obstruct justice. It wasn't a local Mexican prosecution. This was now within the jurisdiction of the United States government and putting to trial someone for killing its own citizens that just happened to be done across the border. In court, the prosecution laid out a narrative that this was as much about planning as it was about murder and violence. The prosecution argued that on May 1st and into the early hours of May 2nd, David lured Jake out of the hotel with a made-up story about a friend stranded on the road. On that dark stretch of the highway, they added, he attacked Jake with a knife, stabbing him 24 times and cutting his throat before dragging him over the edge and leaving him in the ravine. But the defense painted a completely different picture. They suggested that Jake had always had the upper hand in the relationship because of his money, and that this relationship was nothing but transactional from the start. They argued that since there was no direct eyewitness to the killing itself, it couldn't have been David. David, they said, had made bad decisions. He had lied to investigators. He had stolen from Jake, but that doesn't make him a murderer. Now it was all up to the jury. And on May 2nd, 2017, exactly 2 years after the day when Jake's body was found in that ravine, the jury returned its verdict. David Enrique Meza was guilty of murdering Jake Clyde Merendino and of conspiracy to obstruct justice. Later that year, at the sentencing, the judge described the killing as shockingly evil, brutal, and unusually heinous. He sentenced David to life in federal prison, plus additional count for obstruction. But it doesn't matter. David is never getting out because there's no parole in the federal system. David will die in prison. And as for Taylor, you might be wondering, was she in on it? That's a question I leave for you, dear viewers, because the prosecutors stopped short of charging her with murder. They did charge her with conspiracy to obstruct justice for her role in providing a false alibi and helping mail the will. However, they did not charge her with the actual murder, so we'll never know unless something changes. She did plead guilty and was sentenced to 21 months in federal prison. For Jake's family and friends, none of this would bring him back, but the verdict did answer the question that had been hanging over the ravine for 2 years. Who killed Jake Merendino? A jury said David Meza did. Please consider subscribing, liking this video, sharing it, and joining the members. I do all this simply out of a passion, and your help is greatly appreciated. Please pick one of my other videos on screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.